We've all heard of Nostradamus, the alleged seer whose predictions of the French Revolution and the rise of Hitler helped to make him famous. But he's far from the only person who's made predictions that turned out to be true. In fact, there are plenty of other people throughout history whose predictions came true in ways they likely never could have imagined. Hi, I'm the host, and this is my channel. Now, these are the most predictive books in history. Let's do it. Ancient Greek poet and philosopher Hesiod lived around 750 BC on the Greek island of Aspendos. He was also the author of Theogony, which tells the story of the origins of the gods in Greek mythology. But his most famous work is Works and Days, a didactic poem about how humans should live their lives, which he wrote after being driven from his homeland by a series of devastating floods, famines, and droughts. In it, he details the order in which the 5 ages of man will come into existence. And surprisingly, for someone writing almost 3 millennia ago, he actually nailed all but one of them. According to Hesiod, humanity began with the Golden Age, a time when men lived like gods, and didn't have a damn thing to worry about because all of their needs were met easily. Then came the Silver Age, which was worse than the Golden Age despite being less well known. The Silver Age men were more advanced than their Golden Age counterparts. They knew how to farm and build houses, but they weren't yet advanced enough to understand how to properly worship the gods. So Zeus punished them by giving them another go at being less advanced. That was the Bronze Age. These guys were strong as hell, bigger and stronger than the previous generations, but they were also incredibly violent. Their armor was made of bronze, and their spirits were unyielding, making them a violent bunch. But they went extinct after messing with the gods. When Zeus was forced to destroy them, he reserved some of their metal to create the race of heroes of the Fourth Age, the Age of Heroes, which would culminate in the birth of Perseus. Finally, we have the Iron Age, which is the one Hesiod got wrong. Instead of being the current age we live in, which if we're honest is probably worse than the Age of Heroes, he predicted that the Iron Age would eventually give way to another Golden Age, where goodness and piety would return to the world. This is the age of peace and prosperity that hasn't happened yet, but maybe we're getting close. You know, just maybe. Considered to be the father of sociology and one of the greatest thinkers of all time, Auguste Comte was born in 1798 during the French Revolution. It was an event so monumental that it inspired him to devote his life to the idea of progress, which he saw as the key to humanity's future. He began by writing a book about the subject, which he called The Positive Philosophy, in which he argued that humanity progressed through 3 different stages of development: theological, metaphysical, and positive. Each stage represented a different way of understanding the world, with the theological stage being the most primitive and the positive stage being the most advanced. And each stage had its own dominant mode of thinking which Kant believed were analogous to the way children develop. Theologians are like little kids, metaphysicians are teenagers, and positivists are adults. He expanded on these ideas in his next 2 books, The Positive Polity and The Positive Religion, where he put forward the idea of a secular religion based on humanity's progress rather than God's law, which would eventually culminate in a sort of utopian society governed by what he called the Law of Three, which stated that all social science and scientific progress follows a predictable 3-stage process. First, there is a stage of theological confusion, then a stage of metaphysical generalization, followed by a stage of positive or scientific precision. Kant even developed a term for people like himself who believed in humanity's progress and the Law of Three, calling them positivists. And while Kante's ideas were influential in his day, falling out of fashion in the 20th century, he was right on the money when it comes to our understanding of child development and human progress today. In fact, psychologists now use a slightly modified version of Kante's thought to explain how children develop cognitively, and sociologists still use it to explain how societies develop over time. Finishing school at Oxford in 1924, Aldous Huxley became part of a group of intellectuals who foresaw a future dominated by technology. At the time, scientists were claiming that we were entering a new age of atomic power, mass production, and advanced automation. And Huxley and his friends believed that these advancements would change the nature of what it meant to be human. Huxley wanted to explore what a hyper-technological future might look like and how it might affect us, so he wrote Brave New World, which depicts a dystopian future where genetic engineering and reproductive technology has advanced to the point where the government farms humans like cattle and uses hypnopedic conditioning to turn their citizens into docile consumers. While it was initially a critical flop, Brave New World has since become one of the most important texts of the 20th century, having been cited as an inspiration by everyone from George Orwell to Margaret Atwood. And Huxley's prediction of a technological dystopia has proven to be frighteningly accurate, thanks in no small part to the advent of things like reality TV, social media, and government surveillance. In 1930, Soviet economist Nikolai Kondratiev wrote a paper proposing that capitalist economies follow long waves of growth and decline. He called these waves long-term structural crises, and he claimed that they were caused by the gradual obsolescence of technologies that ultimately resulted in catastrophic economic downturns, something he referred to as a capitalist breakdown. Nikolai's ideas were unfortunately seen as contrary to Soviet ideology, and he was arrested in 1930. Spent much of the next decade jumping between prisons and gulags before being executed in 1940. But despite his theories getting him killed, his ideas laid the foundation for our modern understanding of long-term economic trends. In fact, economists today categorize periods of rapid economic expansion and modernization as being in a K-wave, which is named after Kondratiev, and they've identified 5 such waves since the Industrial Revolution. The first being the Industrial Revolution itself, the second being the rise of heavy industry and railroads, the third being the rise of automobiles and mass production, the fourth being the computer and microprocessor, and the fifth being globalization and the internet. But Kondratiev was also right about something else, something he didn't write down anywhere because it was a personal observation he made while imprisoned in a gulag. There he noticed that the inmates felt hopeless and listless, lacking any motivation to improve their situation. In fact, he said that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get anyone excited about the possibility of a post-Stalinist Soviet Union. His observation was that totalitarian regimes actively break their citizens' souls. Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky once said that no science fiction writer has ever dreamed up worlds as strange and as terrifying as the one we're recreating ourselves. As an expert in both geology and radiobiology, Vernadsky was particularly worried about the impact nuclear weapons and radioactive waste would have on the environment. In his 1927 book, The Radioactive Earth, suggested that the Earth as a whole could become radioactive, turning it into what he called a radioactive shell. In his book, Vernadsky suggested that this process would gradually turn the Earth into a sea of radioactive gas and plasma, which would then go supernova and scatter across the universe. Some of the radioactive particles would eventually come back to Earth in the form of radiation, which would then trigger a chain reaction that would eventually consume the entire planet. This theory was pretty much nonsense, but Vernadsky was onto something else. In 1929, he published a book called Biosphere, in which he theorized that the Earth itself was a living organism, which he called the biosphere, consisting of all living things, as well as the atmosphere, soil, and water they depend on to survive. Vernadsky argued that the biosphere was capable of regulating itself, and that human activity was unlikely to do any real damage. However, by the 1960s, Vernadsky realized that he may have been wrong. Humans were beginning to dump massive amounts of chemicals into the environment, and Vernadsky started to worry that it would end up killing everything. He revisited the idea in a book he published in 1971 called The Biosphere and the New Sphere, in which he predicted that humans could end up destroying the biosphere. Now that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Click here to watch one of these next videos and let me know in the comments which of these books you think was the most predictive. Or click here to check out this video instead. Whatever you do, please make sure to subscribe.